man's life a thing apart, 'tis woman's whole existence, did not apply to her any more than to George Washington or any other masculine worker on the heroic scale. Had she lived in our time, picture postcards might have been sold of her as a general. They would not have been sold of her as a sultana. Nevertheless, there is one reason for crediting her with a very remarkable face. A sculptor of her time in Orleans made a statue of a helmeted young woman with a face that is unique in art in point of being evidently not an ideal face but a portrait, and yet so uncommon as to be unlike any real woman one has ever seen. It is surmised that Joan served unconsciously as the sculptor's model. There is no proof of this, but those extraordinarily spaced eyes raise so powerfully the question, if this woman be not Joan, who is she? That I dispense with further evidence and challenge those who disagree with me to prove a negative. It is a wonderful face, but quite neutral from the point of view of the operatic beauty fancier. Such a fancier may perhaps be finally chilled by the prosaic fact that Joan was the defendant in a suit for breach of promise of marriage, and that she conducted her own case and won it. Joan's social position. By class, Joan was the daughter of a working farmer who was one of the headmen of his village, and transacted its feudal business for it with the neighboring squires and their lawyers. When the castle in which the villagers were entitled to take refuge from raids became derelict, he organized a combination of half a dozen farmers to obtain possession of it so as to occupy it when there was any danger of invasion. As a child, Joan could please herself at times with being the young lady of this castle. Her mother and brothers were able to follow and share her fortune at court without making themselves notably ridiculous. These facts leave us no excuse for the popular romance that turns every heroine into either a princess or a beggar maid. In the somewhat similar case of Shakespeare, a whole inverted pyramid of wasted research has been based on the assumption that he was an illiterate laborer, in the face of the plainest evidence that his father was a man of business, and at one time a very prosperous one, married to a woman of some social pretensions. There is the same tendency to drive Joan into the position of a hired shepherd girl, though a hired shepherd girl in Domremy would have deferred to her as the young lady of the farm. The difference between Joan's case and Shakespeare's is that Shakespeare was not illiterate. He had been to school and knew as much Latin and Greek as most university passmen retain. That is, for practical purposes, none at all. Joan was absolutely illiterate. "I do not know A from B," she said. But many princesses at that time, and for long after, might have said the same. Marie Antoinette, for instance, at Joan's age, could not spell her own name correctly, but this does not mean that Joan was an ignorant person, or that she suffered from the diffidence and sense of social disadvantage now felt by people who cannot read or write. If she could not write letters, she could and did dictate them, and attach full and indeed excessive importance to them. When she was called a shepherd lass to her face, she very warmly resented it, and challenged any woman to compete with her in the household arts of the mistresses of well-furnished houses. She understood the political and military situation in France much better than most of our newspaper-fed university women graduates understands the corresponding situation of their own country today. Her first convert was the neighboring commandant at Vaucouleurs, and she converted him by telling him about the defeat of the Dauphin's troops at the Battle of Herrings so long before he had official news of it that he concluded she must have had a divine revelation. This knowledge of and interest in public affairs was nothing extraordinary among farmers in a war-swept countryside. Politicians came to the door, too often sword in hand, to be disregarded. Joan's people could not afford to be ignorant of what was going on in the feudal world. They were not rich, and Joan worked on the farm as her father did, driving the sheep to pasture and so forth. but there is no evidence or suggestion of sordid poverty, and no reason to believe that Joan had to work as a hired servant works, or indeed to work at all, when she preferred to go to confession, or dawdle about waiting for visions, and listening to the church bells to hear voices in them. In short, much more of a young lady, and even of an intellectual, than most of the daughters of our petty bourgeoisie. Joan's voices and visions. Joan's voices and visions have played many tricks with her reputation. They have been held to prove that she was mad, that she was a liar and impostor, that she was a sorceress (she was burned for this), and finally that she was a saint. They do not prove any of these things, but the variety of the conclusions reached show how little our matter-of-fact historians know about other people's minds, or even about their own. There are people in the world whose imagination is so vivid that when they have an idea it comes to them as an audible voice, sometimes uttered by a visual figure. Criminal lunatic asylums are occupied largely by murderers who have obeyed voices. Thus, a woman may hear voices telling her that she must cut her husband's throat and strangle her child as they lie asleep, and she may feel obliged to do what she is told. By a medico-legal superstition, it is held in our courts that criminals whose temptations present themselves under these illusions are not responsible for their actions and must be treated as insane. But the seers of visions and the hearers of revelations are not always criminals. The inspirations and intuitions and unconsciously reasoned conclusions of genius sometimes assume similar illusions. Socrates, Luther, Swedenborg, Blake saw visions and heard voices just as St. Francis and St. Joan did. If Newton's imagination had been of the same vividly dramatic kind, he might have seen the ghost of Pythagoras walk into the orchard and explain why the apples were falling. Such an illusion would have invalidated neither the theory of gravitation nor Newton's general sanity. What is more, the visionary method of making the discovery would not be a whit more miraculous than the normal method. The test of sanity is not the normality of the method, but the reasonableness of the discovery. If Newton had been informed by Pythagoras that the moon was made of green cheese, then Newton would have been locked up. Gravitation, being a reasoned hypothesis which fitted remarkably well into the Copernican version of the observed physical facts of the universe, established Newton's reputation for extraordinary intelligence, and would have done so no matter how fantastically he had arrived at it. Yet this theory of gravitation is not so impressive a mental feat as his astounding chronology, which establishes him as the king of mental conjurers, but a bedlamite king whose authority no one now accepts. On the subject of the 11th horn of the beast seen by the prophet Daniel, he was more fantastic than Joan, because his imagination was not dramatic but mathematical, and therefore extraordinarily susceptible to numbers. Indeed, if all his works were lost except his chronology, we should say that he was as mad as a hatter. As it is, who dares diagnose Newton as a madman? In the same way, Joan must be judged a sane woman, in spite of her voices, because they never gave her any advice that might not have come to her from her mother's wit, exactly as gravitation came to Newton. We can all see now, especially since the late war threw so many of our women into military life, that Joan's campaigning could not have been carried on in petticoats. This was not only because she did a man's work, but because it was morally necessary that sex should be left out of the question as between her and her comrades in arms. She gave this reason herself when she was pressed on the subject, and the fact that this entirely reasonable necessity came to her imagination first as an order from God delivered through the mouth of St. Catherine does not prove that she was mad. The soundness of the order proves that she was unusually sane, but its form proves that her dramatic imagination played tricks with her senses. Her policy was also quite sound. Nobody disputes that the relief of Orleans, followed up by the coronation at Reims of the Dauphin, as a counterblow to the suspicions then current of his legitimacy and consequently of his title, were military and political masterstrokes that saved France. They might have been planned by Napoleon or any other illusion-proof genius. They came to Joan as an instruction from her council, as she called her visionary saints, but she was none the less an able leader of men for imagining her ideas in this way. The evolutionary appetite. What, then, is the modern view of Joan's voices and visions and messages from God? The 19th century said that they were delusions, but that as she was a pretty girl and had been abominably ill-treated and finally done to death by a superstitious rabble of medieval priests, hounded on by a corrupt political bishop, it must be assumed that she was the innocent dupe of these delusions. The 20th century finds this explanation too vapidly commonplace and demands something more mystic. I think the 20th century is right, because an explanation which amounts to Joan being mentally defective instead of, as she obviously was, mentally excessive, will not wash. I cannot believe, nor if I could I expect all my readers to believe, as Joan did, that three ocularly visible, well-dressed persons, named respectively St. Catherine, St. Margaret, and St. Michael, came down from heaven and gave her certain instructions with which they were charged by God for her. Not that such a belief would be more improbable or fantastic than some modern beliefs which we all swallow, but there are fashions and family habits in belief, and it happens that my fashion being Victorian and my family habit Protestant, I find myself unable to attach any such objective validity to the form of Joan's visions. But that there are forces at work which use individuals for purposes far transcending the purpose of keeping these individuals alive and prosperous and respectable and safe and happy in the middle station in life, which is all any good bourgeois can reasonably require, is established by the fact that men will, in the pursuit of knowledge and of social readjustments for which they will not be a penny the better, and are indeed often many pence the worse, face poverty, infamy, exile, imprisonment, dreadful hardship, and death. Even the selfish pursuit of personal power does not nerve men to the efforts and sacrifices which are eagerly made in pursuit of extensions of our power over nature, though these extensions may not touch the personal life of the seeker at any point. There is no more mystery about this appetite for knowledge and power than about the appetite for food. Both are known as facts, and as facts only, the difference between them being that the appetite for food is necessary to the life of the hungry man, and is therefore a personal appetite, whereas the other is an appetite for evolution, and therefore a superpersonal need. The diverse manners in which our imaginations dramatize the approach of the superpersonal forces is a problem for the psychologist, not for the historian. Only the historian must understand that visionaries are neither impostors nor lunatics. It is one thing to say that the figure Joan recognized as St. Catherine was not really St. Catherine, but the dramatization by Joan's imagination of that pressure upon her, of the driving force that is behind evolution, which I have just called the evolutionary appetite. It is quite another to class her visions with the vision of two moons seen by a drunken person, or with Brocken spectres, echoes, and the like. St. Catherine's instructions were far too cogent for that, and the simplest French peasant who believes in apparitions of celestial personages to favored mortals is nearer to the scientific truth about Joan than the rationalist and materialist historians and essayists who feel obliged to set down a girl who saw saints and heard them talking to her as either crazy or mendacious. If Joan was mad, all Christendom was mad too, For people who believe devoutly in the existence of celestial personages are every whit as mad in that sense as the people who think they see them. Luther, when he threw his inkhorn at the devil, was no more mad than any other Augustinian monk. He had a more vivid imagination, and had perhaps eaten and slept less. That was all.